This happened to me when I was in college in the late 80s. I worked the swing shift as an intern at a publishing company, and it had been a hard day at work. And all I wanted was to get home, pour myself a glass of wine, and forget about the pile of paperwork waiting for me tomorrow. The bus I usually took had already come and gone, and the next one wasn't due for another 45 minutes. That's when the cab pulled to the curb. It wasn't a company cab, no logo, no meter on the dash, just an old sedan with a taxi sign on the roof that looked like it had been taped there. But I was tired, it was cold, and the driver gave me a friendly smile. "Need a ride?" he asked through the rolled-down passenger window. I hesitated, glancing up and down the mostly empty street. It was late, and I didn't feel like waiting around in the dark. Besides, I told myself, what are the chances something would go wrong? I opened the door and slid into the back seat. "Thank you," I said, giving him my address. The driver nodded and pulled away from the curb. The interior of the car smelled faintly of cigarettes. His dashboard was cluttered with fast food wrappers and crumpled receipts, and a small, faded air freshener shaped like a pine tree dangled from the rearview mirror. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The driver made small talk, asking me how my day had been, if I worked nearby, and if I lived alone. His questions were casual enough, but I didn't like the direction the conversation was going. He seemed more interested in my answers than he should have been, and his questions were all about me. I started to feel uneasy when I noticed he wasn't taking the usual route to my neighborhood. "I think you missed the turn," I said, leaning forward slightly. He didn't respond. "Excuse me," I said louder this time. "You're going the wrong way." The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his smile gone. "Relax," he said. "It's a shortcut." I didn't like the way he said it. My heart began to race as I glanced out the window trying to get my bearings. The streets were unfamiliar, darker, and more desolate than I was comfortable with. "Can you just stop here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll get out and walk." "No can do," he replied. Panic started to set in. This was the days before everyone had cell phones, and even if I did have a phone, I don't know if it would have gotten reception. The car suddenly slowed as the driver turned onto a narrow dirt road lined with trees. "Stop the car," I shouted at him. He didn't. Without thinking, I grabbed the door handle and pulled. To my relief, the door wasn't locked. The car was still moving, but I didn't care. I threw it open and jumped, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the brush at the side of the road. Pain shot through my shoulders and knees, but I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The sound of the car dragging to a stop on the dirt road behind me made my stomach drop, but I didn't stop. The trees closed in around me as I ran blindly through the woods, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I could hear him behind me, shouting something I couldn't make out over the pounding of my heart in my ears. Eventually, the trees thinned and I stumbled onto a residential street. A police car was parked a few yards away, its lights off. I ran to it, waving my arms and shouting for help. A uniformed officer stepped out of the car, his expression one of confusion that quickly turned to concern as he saw me. "Are you okay?" he asked, moving toward me. "There's a man pretending to be a cab driver," I panted, pointing back towards the woods. "He wouldn't stop the car." The officer's face darkened and he immediately radioed for backup. He told me to get in the car while he went to check the area. I sat in the back seat, trembling as I watched him disappear into the trees with a flashlight. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I jumped at every rustle of leaves and distant sound. Finally, the officer returned, his face grim. "He's gone," he said, "but you're safe now. Let's get you home." I wouldn't usually recommend running up to a would-be cop after getting out of a situation with a probably not cab driver, but I was hedging my bets that 2 incidents like this in one day wouldn't happen. The ride back to my apartment was quiet. The officer asked me a few questions, taking notes as I recounted what had happened. When he pulled to my apartment, he offered to wait until I got inside. I told him thank you and went inside. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my legs shaking. The apartment was dark and silent, but I still didn't feel safe. I had given that driver my address, and he could have come looking for me. I didn't have family nearby, but I did have a few friends I made through school, and after hearing the story, they insisted that I stay with them. I visited my apartment to get clothes and supplies a few times, but ultimately my lease was up soon, and my friends let me stay at their place until the lease ended and I got a new apartment. I never saw the driver again, which I'm thankful for, but I also haven't used a taxi since then, opting for rideshare apps once they were available. I keep replaying that night in my head, trying to convince myself that I imagined it all. But the police report sits in my email inbox. Confirmation that what happened on those dark mountain roads was real, and the man who pulled me over wasn't who he claimed to be. It started as a normal Saturday evening in late January. I was heading to Emma's house party up in Netherlands, about an hour into the Colorado mountains. The snow had started falling lightly, nothing unusual for this time of year. My headlights cut through the darkness as I wound my way up Boulder Canyon, the cliff walls rising like black curtains on either side. The flash of red and blue lights in my rearview mirror came out of nowhere. I hadn't been speeding. I'm always careful on mountain roads, especially in winter. But I pulled over anyway, my tires crunching on the snow-covered shoulder. The patrol car stopped behind me, its lights painting the falling snow in alternating colors. Something felt off from the moment he approached my window. His uniform looked right, but there was something about his movements that seemed wrong, almost theatrical, like someone playing a role. His breath smelled like stale beer, and his eyes had a glassy, unfocused quality that made my skin crawl. When he spoke, his words were slightly slurred but deliberate, as if he was concentrating too hard on each syllable. He wrote a ticket for going 15 over the speed limit, even though I knew that wasn't true, but something in my gut told me not to argue. I just wanted him gone. Wanted those glassy eyes to stop staring at me through the driver's side window. When he finally walked away, I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. For the rest of the drive to Emma's, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made my stomach clench. By the time I reached the party, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. The warmth of Emma's house, filled with familiar faces and laughter, helped ease my nerves. But paranoia has a way of protecting you sometimes. 4 hours later, I was heading home. The snow had picked up and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. When my tire pressure sensor lit up, I barely gave it a second thought. Mountain driving does that. The pressure changes with the altitude, but 15 minutes later, my car started pulling hard to the right, and I knew something was wrong. I pulled over and got out to check. The beam of my flashlight revealed what I couldn't have imagined. All 4 tires were completely flat. The front right had actually separated from the rim. This wasn't normal wear or temperature changes. Someone had slashed my tires. That's when I saw those red and blue lights again, appearing through the curtain of snow like an evil omen. Same patrol car, same officer, same wrong feeling. My hands were shaking as I got back in my car and locked the doors. He approached, offering help, insisting he could drive me to a gas station. His smile never reached his eyes, and his badge number, which I made sure to note this time, was partially obscured by what looked like electrical tape. I called Emma, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. "Oh yeah, that cop who gave me the ticket earlier, he's here now. No, I'm fine waiting for roadside assistance, but maybe you should come keep me company." She understood immediately. He lingered, becoming more insistent about giving me a ride. Each time I refused, his friendly facade slipped a little more. He kept shifting his weight, looking up and down the empty road, checking his watch. When I mentioned my friends were on their way, something dark flashed across his face. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, he got back in his car and drove away. My friends arrived 10 minutes later, and I broke down telling them everything. The next morning, I called the police department. The dispatcher's response chilled me more than anything else. There was no officer matching that description working that night. The badge number I'd written down didn't exist in their system. The patrol car number I'd noted belonged to a vehicle that had been decommissioned 3 years ago. I still drive those mountain roads. I have to. But now I keep a dash cam running. Sometimes on snowy nights when I'm driving alone, I'll catch a glimpse of red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. My heart stops until I confirm it's a real patrol car. The worst part isn't the fear that he's still out there. It's knowing that somewhere in those mountains, there might be others who weren't as lucky as I was. Others who accepted that ride to that gas station that didn't exist. Getting off work at my summer internship in Tampa, Florida, there was a call for freezing temperatures. Now, for those of you who live in the South, you know what it's like when it freezes. We're just not used to it. I decided to stop by the local Target to pick up a few things before heading back to my apartment to relax with my roommate. Since the afternoon rush had passed, the parking lot was mostly empty, just a handful of cars scattered around. I grabbed a frozen pizza, some sodas and snacks, and headed back out to my car. The sun was setting, and I was already daydreaming about throwing on a movie and chilling for the rest of the evening in the warmth of my apartment. That's when I felt someone tap on my shoulder. Startled, I turned to see a middle-aged man, probably in his late 50s, wearing a baseball cap and a faded polo shirt. He was about 5'9" and looked a little rough around the edges. He asked if I had jumper cables. I told him I didn't, which was true. Then he asked if I could give him a ride because his car had broken down and he needed to get to the bus station a few miles away. Now, I've always been taught to help people when I can, but letting a stranger into my car wasn't high on the list of ways I liked to help people. Still, I didn't want to be rude or judgmental, and I was worried he might freeze out in the cold. He looked harmless enough, and it wasn't like he was asking me for money, so against my better judgment, I told him I could give him a lift. As soon as he got in the car, he started rummaging through his backpack, pulling out a cigarette. I told him politely that I didn't allow smoking in my car, and he put it away. mumbling something I couldn't quite catch. I was starting to regret my decision, but figured it was only a short ride. As we drove, he kept glancing at his phone and muttering about needing to make a stop to grab some money a friend owed him. Alarm bells were going off in my head at this point, but I tried to play it cool. I told him I was on a tight schedule and I couldn't make any detours. Then he made a phone call. I couldn't hear much of what the other person was saying, but his tone made my stomach churn. He mentioned something about meeting out back and making it quick. When he hung up, he casually said, "Change of plans. Just take me to my buddy's house instead. It's closer." At this point, everything in me told me to end this ride, but I didn't want to believe I was in real danger. As we approached the neighborhood he directed me to, I realized it wasn't a residential area. It was an industrial park. The buildings were run down and the street lights barely worked. I stopped the car and told him I couldn't go any further. He got angry, saying I couldn't leave him stranded, but I forced him out of the car, threatening to call the police. That's when two men stepped out from behind one of the buildings, heading straight for my car. One of them was holding something, maybe a wrench or a pipe. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse and peeled out of there, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was back in a crowded gas station parking lot. Looking back, I realized how naive I was. There was no bus station nearby, and the whole story had been a setup. I learned a hard lesson that day. Sometimes helping someone can put you in harm's way. I'm grateful I got out unscathed, but now I think twice before offering a ride to a stranger. I'll write this story quickly because I hate remembering that day, as it is etched into my mind, the chilling memory replaying endlessly whenever I close my eyes. The woods were quiet that day, blanketed in fresh snow that muffled every step. My daughter, Emily, was only 6, and hiking together had always been our thing. She loved the crunch of leaves underfoot, the chill in the air, and the way the sunlight streamed through the trees. I always made sure to keep her close, watching as she ran a little ahead, her stuffed penguin tucked under one arm like a trusty companion. But this time, I had let my guard down. We were about halfway through the trail, just reaching a bend where the trees seemed to close in tighter, when Emily darted ahead, giggling. I smiled, knowing she was probably hiding just around the bend. She loved games like hide and seek. "Emily," I called, my voice breaking the stillness. No response. I quickened my pace, expecting her to jump out from behind a tree, but she didn't. My calls grew louder as I moved faster, my breath clouding in the freezing air. My heart began to pound when I reached the bend and saw no sign of her. The trail ahead was empty, the snow undisturbed except for her small footprints, which veered off the path into the trees. I followed the tracks, shouting her name, but the woods gave no answer. Only the soft crunch of my boots on the snow and the whisper of the wind through the branches accompanied me. I doubled back, retracing my steps to the car, hoping she had turned around and was waiting there. My breath hitched with every step, my mind racing with worry. She wasn't there. Panic set in. I called the police, my voice trembling as I gave them every detail I could remember. What she was wearing, where had I last seen her. They assured me help was on the way, but waiting felt unbearable. The minutes dragged like hours. I decided to search again, this time telling the dispatcher exactly where I was headed. The trail was quiet, eerily so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching through the snow. It was then I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. A narrow path branching off from the main trail, partially hidden by dense undergrowth. I hesitated, but felt a pull to follow it. The new trail was unsettling. The trees were marked with strange carvings, rough symbols that looked hastily etched. The air was still, unnaturally so, and every step seemed louder than the last. My breath came quicker as I pushed forward, calling for Emily. The trail twisted deeper into the woods, and then I saw it. A fox hung from a low branch, its body gutted and frozen in the icy air. The snow beneath it was stained dark. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, my mind on Emily. Then I heard it. Faint crying carried through the stillness, a small, broken sound that made my heart leap. I ran, my boots slipping on the icy ground, my calls for Emily growing louder, her cries growing clearer, leading me further down the trail. I paused for a moment when I saw crude masks, crafted from twigs and vines nailed to the trees along the path. They looked hollow, lifeless, but their placement felt intentional. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by a scream that sent my blood running cold. I sprinted, ignoring the burning in my lungs. Then, in a small clearing, I found her. Emily was sitting in the snow, clutching her stuffed penguin to her chest. Her face was streaked with tears, her small body trembling. I dropped to my knees, scooping her into my arms, holding her as tightly as I could. I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing in. I didn't linger. I carried her back to the main trail, my pace quick, my ears straining for any soul behind us. When we reached the car, the police had just arrived. Emily wouldn't let go of me, her arms wrapped tightly around my neck. She didn't say a word, even as I explained to the officers what happened. The next few days were a blur. Emily refused to talk, her once bright eyes distant and haunted. When she finally opened up, her words chilled me. She said she'd followed a man off the trail because he seemed nice, like someone who wanted to help. But then he started putting on masks, those same twig masks I'd seen, and scaring her on purpose. She had cried and screamed, but he only laughed, circling her, stepping closer and closer. The police searched the area and found the masks nailed to the tree and the fox hanging from the branch, but there were no signs of the man, no footprints, no evidence, nothing. We never went back to those woods. Even now, years later, Emily refuses to talk about it. But sometimes late at night, I wonder who was out there with her and why.